I don't remember the last time we sat in the living room like that. Just the two of us. The house was quiet. Almost too quiet. The kind of silence that creeps in and makes you uneasy, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. I could hear the ceiling fan clicking in its slow, tired rotation, mocking the space between us. Bronwyn was next to me, though she'd never felt further away. She kept tugging on the sleeve of her shirt, picking at the fabric absentmindedly, and I had this nagging feeling at the back of my mind that something was coming. I couldn't put my finger on it, but Bron had been distant for weeks, maybe months. You start to notice when the laughter dies out, when the small touches disappear, and all that's left is this void. I chalked it up to stress. Maybe it was the kids. Maybe she was restless. I always assumed we'd talk through it, get past whatever was going on, 'cause that's what we did. We were Team Wallace and Bronwyn, right? I was dead wrong. Wrong. I've been thinking about seeing someone else. That was how she said it, not some drunk, angry confrontation, not even in the heat of an argument. Just those words, dropped between us like a stone in still water, slowly rippling out. My brain didn't quite register it at first. Just what? I turned to her, waiting for the punchline, but she wasn't joking. She kept fiddling with that fucking sleeve, not even looking me in the eye. It didn't make sense. She wasn't the kind of person who would, well, I thought she wasn't. My words came out way slower than I wanted, like I had to chew on the shock before spitting them out. What? I finally managed to say. Her voice stayed casual, too casual, like she was talking about the goddamn weather. There's someone else. We haven't slept together, but we've been talking. I sat there, staring, and every word after that just turned into a distant hum. My pulse was the only thing I could hear in sharp contrast. We hadn't slept together. That seemed to be the point she wanted to drive home, as if that somehow erased the betrayal, as if that little technicality made her innocent. His name's Nelson. And she'll see about. Nelson? Who the fuck was Nelson? A neighbor. Old co-worker she ran into. I didn't fucking care. It didn't make a difference. I clammed up for what felt like an eternity, maybe longer. Nelson. Of course he had a name, Wallace. Nelson, who was clearly filling some void I wasn't or couldn't or hadn't. I shook my head slightly, no more like I just stopped, moving, thinking. I was frozen so deep in it, I thought maybe I was dreaming. Her voice kept trailing along next to me, narrating this nightmare that was suddenly my life. It's just a bit of fun, she said next, her tone like she was talking about a goddamn hobby, nothing serious. I could feel my blood rising now, in a way it hadn't in a long, long time. She was rationalizing it, casually minimizing the whole thing. I still love you. She kept going. Nothing has to change. Nothing has to change. Those were her words. Like I was supposed to be okay with this. Like we could continue sitting in that awful fucking living room, in that quiet little suburban drift we've been doing for Christ knows how long, while she carried on this fantasy life with someone else on the side. What was she even thinking? I laughed. Not the happy kind. The kind that bursts out when the only other option is to lose your shit entirely. There was venom in that sound. It surprised even me. You've already betrayed me, I said, the words thick and clumsy coming out of my throat. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was the truth. I couldn't mask the way my hands gripped the fabric of the chair, knuckles white. Like squeezing the life out it might bring back some sense of normalcy. She looked up at me for the first time, but I couldn't stomach the look in her eyes. Not pity. Not regret. Something else. Like she expected me to cooperate, like this was something we were supposed to navigate together. I stood up, and maybe it was a little too quick or maybe too slow, I don't remember. But the room tilted, the air going heavy like it wanted to pin me to the goddamn floor. I couldn't breathe in that space anymore. I had to get out. Standing there in front of Bronwyn, I could feel something inside me thin out like a thread about to snap. My hands clenched, but my voice stayed steady. I wouldn't shout. I didn't need to. I didn't have to pound it into her how serious this was. If she couldn't see the cold edge in my tone, that was her problem, not mine. You think this is a harmless fling messing around with some guy behind my back, but if you go through with this, we're done. The words came out more stiff than I imagined. There wasn't a flicker of hesitation, though. I knew what I was saying. And more importantly, I knew what that meant. She stood there quiet, trying to gauge if I meant it, like she couldn't quite wrap her head around the ultimatum, like this was some game that'd blow over once I cool off. She always did that, made everything smaller than it was, like it wasn't real if she refused to face it. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, a glint of surprise that I would actually take a stance this hard. Or maybe it was because up until now, I hadn't really fought for anything for myself, just for us, for the family. And maybe she thought I'd just let it slide, like so many times before when she went on about how boring things had gotten. Maybe she expected I'd shrug this one off too. But this wasn't some minor disagreement. This was our marriage. This was trust breaking like glass on the floor, shattered past any hope of fixing. Don't expect me to stand around while you screw someone else. The silence after that was so loud that I only had one option left in me: walk away. And that's what I did. Walking away had never felt heavier. Each step across the living room, past the kitchen, out to the driveway, it all seemed to deliberate, like each footfall echoed with the last bit of our life together. I saw my truck parked there like a getaway car, and for a second I almost laughed a bitter kind of laugh. It was laughable, wasn't it? Everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, could unravel because of this. I pulled the driver's side door open, taking a moment to breathe against the weight of realizing that my marriage, our life, was finished. The engine roared to life, the only thing that seemed to cut through the numb ache spreading deeper inside me. When I woke up the next day, it wasn't after a night's rest, but after hours of staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation, if you could call it that, in my head. It gnawed at me that Bronwyn barely argued. She stood there with that look, as if she could process my reaction but not care enough to counter. Felt like I was just part of the furniture in her home. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How the hell does someone throw away their family that easy? I needed to make sense of all this. There's still Rise. There's still Amber, I told myself. My kids. They'd understand what was wrong here. They'd give me something to steady me, so they knew right from wrong. And this, whatever she was doing, was wrong. I needed them to be that anchor. I tried shaking off my growing doubts and made my way to talk to them. My stomach tightened the further I got into the house, but I chose to ignore it. Reese was hanging out in the kitchen, casual as ever, scrolling through his phone like it was another ordinary day. Why, you see us, Shun? Hey, I need to. The thing with me and your mom, it's serious, son. I spat it out quickly, thinking he deserved to know how deep this cut. I half expected surprise, shock at least. Instead, he shrugged, barely looking up from his phone. Yeah, Dad, we knew for a while, actually. I froze. He had to be saying the words wrong, the meaning stuck on his lips wrong. But his tone was flat enough to make it clear. This wasn't some new revelation for him. They knew. You knew your mother was seeing someone, and didn't say anything. My voice, still not raised, rattled out as more of a demand. Like I couldn't believe my own question even needed to be asked. I expected a response more befitting the weight of this betrayal, this devastation. So Amber had walked in by then, her expression telling me she wasn't going to back me up either. But she couldn't look me in the eyes, fidgeting with some bracelet in her hands like a child caught in a lie. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it only made me feel worse. It's Mom's life, Dad. She deserves to be happy. Deserves to be happy. That's how they justified this. A rationalization that felt so flimsy and weak I felt the wind get knocked out of me for the second time in 24 hours. She wasn't showing guilt. She wasn't shaking with blown open truth or desperate apologies. Just Mom deserves to be happy. Their words were bullets, every one of them driving deeper pits into what little self-respect I had left. It didn't feel real. My son, my daughter, had sided with her. They knew about the affair and let me live ages in ignorance. Told me looked like a fool, letting her parade the lie. My legs faltered, weakened, and for a split second I had to grab the back of a chair to stop myself before I crumbled onto the kitchen tile. The roaring in my head was louder now than it had ever been. I didn't know whether I was angrier at them or at myself for expecting more. Maybe Bronwyn had manipulated them to her side. Maybe it was easier with me being distant over the years while I worked my ass off. Maybe they thought they were too grown to care about anything beyond themselves. My chest felt hollow, like someone had vacuumed out all the air. Still, I found myself moving, away from them, away from the house I had broken my back for. It wasn't home. It couldn't be home anymore when the very people I thought I could count on turned their backs like that. I got out the front door without taking a second glance behind me. After that night, Bronwyn dropped her little revelation like it was nothing more than a casual remark. I couldn't stop thinking about how foolish I'd been. For years, I'd been pouring everything I had into securing our future, building the business, providing for the kids. And when I finally thought we'd hit a comfortable stride, a nice house, healthy kids, and the business ticking along, this is what I'm left with. A wife looking for cheap thrills and children who see me as nothing more than a background obligation. So I couldn't let myself get caught out. I had way too much on the line. Bronwyn could do what she wanted, but I sure as hell wasn't going to let her and Nelson walk away with half of what I busted my ass to build. So quietly I started moving the money. At first it was almost laughably easy. We had these shared accounts that we never really even looked at, you know? Figured, why the hell would I need to micromanage it if she wasn't working? Wasn't pulling in any income. I realized how stupid that was now. Blind trust makes you a sucker. So I created some new accounts in my name only and started shifting a bit here and there, just enough that it wouldn't flag anything major at once. I'd wait until I was in the office early, after leaving the house once Bronwyn was still asleep. The silence of the empty workspace made it easy. $2,000 today, $5,000 tomorrow. I made sure every significant business asset was protected. I contacted every partner, every vendor. She all knew to deal strictly with me moving forward. Bled a little bit from every faucet, and before long a healthy chunk was secured in a place I could control. It felt, I don't know. On one hand, I was disgusted that I had to resort to this. On the other, I was pissed that I didn't plan for it sooner. But it wasn't enough to just secure the money. No way was I going to let her keep dipping into everything like nothing was changing. And Riz, Amber, they'd shown their hand too. They thought Bronwyn deserved happiness with this jackass, and I was the obstacle in the way. They hadn't outright said it, but their indifference was like a slap in the face. They'd chosen sides. And when you make choices like that, you deal with the consequences. One afternoon, I finished cutting Bronwyn off from the main accounts and handling the house bills. Everything was redirected into those protected funds. Almost like turning knobs, neatly shutting off one valve and opening another somewhere she couldn't reach. But when it came to the kids, well, that was different. Seeing their faces when I shut them out, that stung in a way I didn't expect. I went through their expenses, Riz with his gas cards, Amber with, I don't know, whatever the hell she spent her small allowance from me on. It didn't make sense to give them any freedom anymore. They were adults, but still, when you're a parent, it's weird how much you still want to help. Even when they spit in your face, I had to shove those feelings down. Their phones gone in an instant. Credit cards cancelled with quick calls to the banks. I stared at Amber's number after cancelling her phone, wondering what she'd say when she found out. Hell, she'd probably find a way to blame me like everything else. Riz would be pissed, no doubt. It was always about convenience with that one. If something didn't line up with his easygoing attitude, suddenly I was some tyrant in his world, too difficult to live with. It didn't take but a couple of hours for the backlash to slap me across the face. First, Riz. The text from him, of course, didn't come through because I'd cut the phone off, but my email exploded. What the hell, Dad? You cut off my phone and cards. Do you really need to be this petty? Mum was right, you never cared about us being happy. I couldn't help the bitter smirk that twisted at my lip. Couldn't even pick up a phone to actually speak to me. He had to fire off some half-assed rant through email. I knew it was coming from a 25-year-old man-child who couldn't wipe his own ass without checking what time brunch was with his latest fling. I marked it unread and slammed the laptop shut. Amber, though, she took longer to react. I considered that maybe she'd come to terms with the fact she sided with her mother. Maybe she wasn't going to kick up a fuss. But as each hour ticked by, the uneasy feeling crept closer. Sure enough, late in the evening I got a letter, typed in some oversized font, as if making the words bigger would force me to listen. It took me an hour to figure out you cut everything. You've made your point, Dad. You're angry. But we can talk about this. Why are you punishing us? This isn't our fight to fix. You can hate Mom, but you made us a part of this mess, so why drag us into it? Look, just unlock some of the accounts. I'm being responsible, okay, Dad? So, prosumble. By whose standard? Bronwyn's. They knew both ends of the mess they were playing in and figured it wouldn't come back to bite them. I stared at Amber's letter for what felt like hours before tucking it into a drawer. There'd be no fixing anything. They'd be chasing after her crumbs while pretending they didn't betray their old man. Anger simmered, sitting low in my gut. I shoved my hands hard into my jacket pockets, feeling the tension digging into my chest. Then there was Bronwyn, still floating along in whatever delusional fantasy let her believe this was all going to work itself out. She was planning a trip with Nelson. That much I knew. She hadn't skipped a damn beat. Hell, she was even acting perkier lately, especially when word came through about Nelson booking tickets for a getaway in Aruba. I didn't confront her about it. What good would that have done? We couldn't communicate like civil people anymore. Anyway, instead I kept my distance while packing up some of my things. That house wasn't my home anymore. Might as well have been a storage unit with a goddamn ghost living in it. When the day finally came for her to leave, suitcases piled neatly in the hallway, I stood at the door. She didn't linger long when she saw I wasn't reacting. Said something about it only being a quick trip. Some fresh air she needed. Have fun, I told her. Clipped hard. The words didn't leak any emotion, because I made sure they didn't. But it was like throwing hot coals. Her eyes narrowed for half a second, something almost guilty crossing her face. And then she was gone. I stayed at my parents' house when Bronwyn left for that trip with Nelson. It had been years since I'd stepped foot in there for anything more than a holiday visit or a quick check-in. After moving out and starting my own life, I guess I never really thought of it as mine anymore. But walking through that old wooden door again, everything smelled the same, felt the same. The faint scent of pine cleaner, the creaky floorboard near the entry that was always a little loose. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. Worse somehow, because now it wasn't home, not really. Mom looked at me. Her face full of lines even deeper than I remembered. Her eyes the same bright blue as mine but dulled by age. She didn't have to ask. She always had a way of knowing when something was wrong. Dad sat in his usual chair by the window. The old man hadn't been as sharp lately, but when I told him about the mess I was in, he gave me that same look he'd given me when I failed my first college class. Disappointed but not surprised. That woman, he muttered under his breath. Mom didn't say much. She just patted me on the back, nodded softly, like that was all she could do. She seemed saddened but not shocked, almost like she'd been waiting for this, ever since Bronwyn started pulling away all those years ago. I mean, they'd been together for 50 years. Maybe they saw it coming before I ever did. I spent the next few nights in my old bedroom, the posters I'd hung up in high school still tacked to the wall, peeling at the edges, a damn time capsule frozen in place. Wally's pre-business, pre-marriage, pre-everything falling apart. Apparently my parents decided not to touch it after I packed my bags and left for college. So lying in that bed felt like a slap in the face, as if young me was staring at the man I'd become, judging the decisions, the years given away for nothing. I found myself staring up at the ceiling, trying to push the memories out of my mind, but they wouldn't stop. It was the same ceiling I stared at when I first realized I was falling for Bronwyn. So those nights were long and sleep barely came, but they brought me clarity. I realized that no matter how much I tried to make things right, to talk to the kids or salvage sense of family, it was pointless. They had made their choice. Bronwyn had led them down this path, and they followed her without a backward glance at me. Rhys with his casual dismissal of everything I'd sacrificed for them, and Amber, who, well, she'd always been swayed by whatever spell her mother cast. It was simple now. Cut them off. Rhys tried calling once or twice, but I didn't pick up. Then the texts started, all variations of the same thing. Why cut us off financially? What's your problem? I never typed a word back. Knowing him, he figured Bronwyn would always have his back and find a way to smooth everything over. That's how it's always been, his cocksure attitude. Like the world and the money I bled for were just things that would always be there, handed to him like they came from thin air. They weren't even his concerns, not now when they rattled his world of convenience. Amber, I expected more from her. To be honest, her silence hurt the most. I thought for a minute there was a shred of her that would understand, that would see why I had to do what I did. But nothing. No calls, no texts, just another black hole where family used to be. I blocked both their numbers, told my solicitor to handle the rest. I was done trying to convince them, hell, trying to convince myself that there was anything left to salvage. Bronwyn was soaking up Caribbean sun while I ripped the cord on the only family I had left, but I bet that little escape she ran off to didn't bring her the joy she thought it would. She expected some fantasy, some clean break from the life she was so desperate to leave behind. But the grass never looks quite as good when you're on the other side for real, does it? To a Nelson. From what I had pieced together, he wasn't some knight in shining armor. More like a rattled mess of insecurity and paranoia. It must have worn on her. His constant second-guessing. The way he looked over his shoulder every time they went to dinner, or took a walk on the beach, wondering if I'd catch up to them. As if I gave a damn about tracking them down. What did they expect? Some dramatic showdown in paradise? They had no idea how low on my list of priorities they were. Bronwyn must have realized it, eventually. Realized that Nelson wasn't the escape she hoped for, that he wasn't different enough. That maybe the life she left behind, however stifling she made it out to be, wasn't so bad compared to the hollow affair she threw herself into. Her silence from Aruba spoke volumes. Meanwhile, I stayed focused. I had a plan now, something more than just wallowing in this disaster. I went over the numbers in my head each night, how much the business was worth, what I could shape into a new future. I dug into listings on my laptop, searching for a place far enough to sever any ties with what my life had become. Somewhere quiet, with no memories of Rice laugh as a kid or Amber running through the backyard. Somewhere away from the weight the Bronwyn's betrayal had strapped to my chest like a boulder barely manageable to carry. Selling the business wasn't a rash decision. It was my way of stepping away from everything, taking every thread of my old life and snipping it clean at the source. When I handed over my responsibilities to someone new, God knows who, it would be the final weight I dropped. I could retire comfortably, keep to myself, maybe buy a place in the mountains, start fresh, away from the disappointment, that fueling persistent disappointment. And then she came back. I felt it the moment she walked through the door, the air going dense, the same suffocating energy that had pushed me out of our home in the first place. She waltzed in like nothing had changed, like the house was still hers, cluttered it up again with her presence. But this time was different. I didn't match her energy with anger anymore. I didn't throw down words to try and fix things or claw back at emotions that had already died in me. I gave her the coldness she deserved, a distance that, at this point, was a mercy. I ignored her, barely moved when she sat at the kitchen table and tried to float the first weak attempts at a conversation. "Wallace, do you want to talk about this?" I didn't lift my eyes from the paper I was scanning. She got the message. I think that scared her most, seeing the life drain out of me, the connection she had frayed down to almost nothing, finally snapping. Bronwyn stood there, blocking my way in the kitchen. Her arms crossed like it was some kind of shield. A defense mechanism, maybe. Her eyes darting back and forth between mine, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. It was almost funny, in a grim sort of way. If the situation wasn't so wrecked, I might have laughed. But there wasn't room for laughter. "We can fix this, Wallace," she said, her voice cracking in a way that made it sound like she was on the verge of either tears or rage. I wasn't sure which, and I wasn't interested in finding out. My grip tightened on the glass I was holding, trying to keep the calm, that icy exterior I'd been perfecting the last few weeks. She had to see there was nothing left here. No home, no marriage. Just pieces of something that had shattered long before she even admitted it. I had been so damn blind. "There's nothing to fix, Bronwyn." I spoke slowly, letting each word sink in. "We're done. You made your choice, and now I've made mine." Her face dropped. I could almost see the exact moment the weight of those words hit her. She had that wide-eyed look, like for the first time she actually understood where we were, where she'd brought us. Her lip trembled. Just a little. Anyone else might find it pitiful. It used to get to me. The old "I didn't mean for this to happen" routine, like we were playing some teenage drama. But I wasn't that man anymore. Whatever thread was left between us had snapped weeks ago, right after the kids told me they already knew about Nelson. The betrayal had run deep. Bronwyn didn't realize it then. She thought I could be convinced, swayed somehow by our history. That history was dead the minute she sided herself with Nelson. By this point, I wasn't in the mood to listen to her stammer out some apology or excuse. Moving past her, I dumped the rest of my drink in the sink. Didn't matter what she said. Nothing was going to change. The days drifted after that last confrontation, like my life was moving through thick fog. I could hear Bronwyn moving around the house, her footsteps heavy, awkward. There was an odd silence to it now. The weight of everything she'd done now finally a reality. That silence, it wasn't accusing anymore. It wasn't begging, just empty. Where she had once flirted her way into Nelson's arms, now she walked around our house like she didn't belong there, and she didn't. Part of me figured she thought I'd cave eventually, but she was wrong. There was a time when I might have, when her recklessness made me want to fix things, bring her back to me. I'd hoped she'd wake up one day and realize what we had was worth saving. But every day brought an even sharper clarity. Nothing was left to save. I began packing for Tokyo, mentally checking out, dealing with the last few pieces of my business. It felt almost comical, the way Bronwyn lashed out without really doing anything. A slammed door here, a loud shuffle across the floor. Her presence had become just that noise, meaningless, grating at times, easy to ignore at others. She hadn't tried any more big gestures after that kitchen confrontation. Maybe she sensed the futility of it. Maybe she was waiting for me to break first. But there's something about betrayal that hardens a man way past what seems reasonable. Break? I wasn't going to break. Not again. The kids. She hadn't even told them. Or maybe she did. They didn't call. No surprise there. I wondered if they'd take her side once more when this all unraveled publicly. Didn't matter. I'd stopped expecting anything decent from them, after the whole family turned this into some sort of twisted justification for her happiness. Flying to Tokyo was a relief, honestly. Once the plane lifted off, I felt the distance physically. The weight, the constant grief of what my life had become, it lightened some. Not much, but enough to get oxygen back into my lungs again. Staring out the small window next to me, it struck me just how far I was willing to go to escape. A few years ago, the idea of moving my business, something I'd bled for, would have sounded insane. But now, every mile between me and Bronwyn was another nail in the coffin of the past that didn't deserve to be resuscitated. Tokyo was chaos as usual, and that suited me just fine. The meetings blurred together, papers shuffled from desk to desk, men in dark suits who nodded solemnly, as if they didn't know this was my exit strategy. They had no idea they were part of something much bigger for me. I wasn't just selling dollars and figures. I was selling off the last ties to the man Wallace used to be. But it wasn't totally smooth sailing. The quiet moments, the downtime after hours in boardrooms, the loneliness had its way of pulling me back. It crept up on me in the hotel room when all the noise stopped. Tokyo's crowds, the deadlines, they could keep me distracted. But you're forced to face the silence regardless. Bronwyn had no part in those moments. It wasn't about her anymore. It was just me, slowly coming to terms with the fact that I had nothing left waiting for me. Back home, though, I heard Nelson was proving to be about as useful as I imagined. Bronwyn had this wild idea that starting a second life with him would fill some gaping void. But life had a hell of a way of putting reality in front of people. Nelson, last I heard, had been unwell, his health deteriorating, likely stealing whatever thrill Bronwyn had been chasing. Nelson was many things, weak, needy, insecure as hell, but exciting wasn't on that list anymore. I imagined her sitting there, probably by his side, and finding herself stuck. No more spice of life to chase after. Just the burden I knew he'd become. So I bet she didn't expect to suddenly go from the carefree cheating wife to the put-upon caretaker for some old man who couldn't even take care of himself anymore. The man she risked everything for had, predictably, turned out to be another weight on her shoulders. Karma wasn't just a bitch, he'd had one hell of a sense of humor, too. And that's where I imagined she was now, weighed down by a mistake of her own making, with no way to crawl back out. Whatever fantasy she chased was starting to rot in front of her face. I could almost see it, Bronwyn trying to smile through it, pretending that this wasn't what it had all boiled down to. But it had. Tokyo did a number on me, almost like it had wanted to shake loose. All those years sticking to me, the weight of Bronwyn, the kids, everything I thought I'd built, crumbling while I was too damn busy working to see it coming. When I first landed, the streets felt like an assault. Neon lights blaring overhead, hordes of people moving like currents of a river. In a way, I liked it at first. No one knew me. No one cared. I could just disappear, which is exactly what I needed after everything imploded back home. If I kept moving, maybe I could outrun the thought of Bronwyn and Nelson. That image burned into my mind. But Tokyo didn't let me run. Everywhere I went, there was this buzz, this constant reminder that life moved forward, no matter what you tried to leave behind. Most nights after work, I'd find myself wandering through the crowded alleys, barely noticing the world around me. But at some point, between the ramen shop owners calling out in Japanese and the smell of freshly fried street food wafting through the air, it started to hit me this was how life smelled now. I wasn't the man I used to be, and that was fine, more than fine, really. Hell, what tied me to that version of myself anyway? A marriage with more cracks than I'd wanted to admit. 2 kids who'd turned their backs the second it suited them. I had boxed myself into a corner for years, always telling myself this was just part of the family grind. I found out family wasn't always family the hard way. Bronwyn, Reese, and Amber, none of them deserved the labor I put in. That whole time I was breaking my back for them, they were just waiting for the right moment to stab it. I used to wake up thinking about what I'd done wrong, what more I could have given them, why none of it seemed to matter in the end. But now, walking the streets of Tokyo, I could almost laugh at the ridiculousness of it all, trying to find answers when the truth was staring me in the face. Sometimes people just don't deserve you. There came a moment I stood still, staring up at one of the towering screens, flashing some Japanese pop star's face, and a weird kind of clarity sank in. I wasn't grieving anymore, not for the life I used to have. That life wasn't even really mine, it was something I'd been trapped in. The people there were nothing to lose. They'd already lost me a long time ago. I was just the last one to realize we weren't even on the same team anymore. That realization hit me hard, but it also felt like I finally let go of something dark that had latched onto me. Soon after, I left Tokyo. While the clarity was helpful, the city itself wasn't where I wanted to stay. It did its job, though. It woke me up. After a couple of quick trips through other cities and countries, I somehow ended up in Thailand. Totally different pace from the neon chaos of Japan. There was a softer edge here. People moved in a slower rhythm, and the landscape stretched out like it had no rush to get anywhere. Kind of mirrored where my own head was at. That's where Dao came into my life. It's funny how things work. When I met her, I wasn't looking for anything. Just trying to get by, same as always. I'd been renting one of those bungalows near the market, away from the tourist traps. Dao caught my eye because she wasn't trying to catch anyone's attention. She just had this way about her, quiet, steady, carried herself with a practical grace, the kind you see in someone who's had to carry more weight on their shoulders than they ever asked for. It wasn't long before I learned her story. Widow. 2 kids, barely scraping by. I started helping out in small ways at first, dropping a few extra bills here and there for her when I learned the market vendors were overcharging her for the basics. Most people in town seemed to respect her, but you could see she had a fair share of struggles when it came to making ends meet for Torn and Palin. Those 2 kids meant the world to her. I don't know what pulled me in. Maybe it was how different she was from everyone I'd ever known. She wasn't after me for money or status. There were no ulterior motives like back home. This lady just did what she had to do for her kids and kept her head down. Before long, I wasn't just helping out at the market. I started paying for their school, making sure her kids had what they needed. Once you start stepping into someone's life, you can't just half-ass it. So, eventually I moved them into a better home and figured, why not? I had more money than I knew what to do with, having cut off Bronwyn and the kids. Maybe helping someone who deserved it would let me feel something real again. What I didn't expect was how much it'd mean to me. Being around Dao's family brought me into this strange new phase. They were simple, yet there was something about that simplicity that spoke louder than any of the bullshit I'd slogged through all those years. No second guesses, no wondering who was scheming behind my back. It was just life, straightforward and kind. Somewhere along the way, her kids started calling me uncle. And I'd be lying if I said that didn't stir something. They looked at me like I was there for them. Part of their little family. A few months in, after I moved them into that new house, everything just felt right. I'd come home from some errand, don't even remember what it was at this point, and Dao pulled me aside. She was never one to mince words, so when she said, straight-faced, that according to local custom she could be my second wife, I just kind of stood there, staring at her for a beat too long. I don't know what I expected life to offer me at this point, but that was a curveball. I could see she wasn't joking. It was practical from her point of view. For me, though, it brought up a lot. My mind went back to Bronwyn, the life I'd sworn off. I wasn't sure I had in me to call someone a wife again, much less step into that role after it ended in such an ugly mess. But I'll say this. Looking at Dao, at the life we had built, quiet and earnest, I felt something calm settle inside. It wasn't like I was racing against my own anger anymore. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't outright against it. Every now and again, thoughts of Bronwyn surface, but it's different now. Used to be that a face would flicker in front of me like a ghost that wouldn't let me sleep. Now it's more like an afterthought, something faded and buried with the rest of the past. I know she's still stuck in that house with Nelson. His condition getting worse. Dorothy sure has a twisted sense of humor. The man she thought would bring her excitement, this new chapter of her life, is just a burden. And now look at her, playing nursemaid to a man who probably can't even give her the thrill she once craved. She's stuck in something far more suffocating than the marriage she ran from. I hear about it from time to time, mostly from some of the mutual friends we had. Funny how none of them reached out when I was drowning, just stood there on the shore, watching. If they pity her these days, they don't say. Usually it's more in that gossipy, she got what she deserved tone, which, well, they're not wrong, are they? Serves her right, chasing some half-baked fantasy that tore apart everything we built. But I don't find any real satisfaction in it anymore. That's the thing. Time went by, and with each passing day here, surrounded by people who actually need me, who care, that bitterness cracked, crumbled bit by bit. I don't feel much for her now, no hate, no pity, just resignation. Let her wrestle with her choices. I've made mine. Which led me here, to this little house by the water, with Dao and the kids. And maybe it's not the life I thought I'd have back when I was working the grind, providing all those years. But it's better. Simpler, maybe, but solid. A life where they see me for who I am, not the bank account, or the provider, not an obligation. When Dao asked me to step into the role here, to marry her in their way, my stomach didn't knot up or scream for me to run. I just nodded. Because it feels right. More right than anything felt in a long time. Torn and Palin, they've started calling me father without hesitation. It didn't feel weird or forced. I take them fishing, teach them what I know about working with your hands. They follow me like I'm someone worth looking up to. Sue, Amber and Riss barely blink when I pop into their heads now, if at all. But these two, they don't even need to know my past. All they care about is that I'm here. And hell, I am here. Fully. When I finally keyed in the number and hit call, it felt like a thread being yanked tight. I don't know what I expected. An argument, indifference, but what I knew deep down was that none of them would be prepared for what I had to show them. Hell, I wasn't sure if I was even ready, but there wasn't a choice. When their faces popped up on screen, Bronwyn, Reese, Amber, all staring back at me from that old living room, one I had once thought was home, it was like looking at strangers. Like the distance I had created myself had scrubbed any remaining familiarity away. Bronwyn was the first to speak. "Why now, Wallace, what's this about?" A bit defensive, a bit confused. Maybe she thought I was about to forgive, that after all this time I had come crawling back. I could see Riz lounging back, barely giving a shit as usual. Amber sat straighter, looking unsure about the whole thing. She'd always been more complicated, but she had made her choices. I didn't play into the small talk. No asking how they were, no pretense. I shifted the camera so Dao appeared next to me. She had Torn and Palin sitting close by, quiet but watching. Her hand was on mine, and that was all the stability I needed. I let my words cut. This is my new family. But it hit exactly as I expected. There was this pause where you could see they weren't really comprehending, and then Bronwyn's face twisted into something unreadable. Riss barely blinked, didn't seem fazed. He was too used to applying the don't give a damn attitude. But Amber's eyes shifted, flickered, finding gears trying to catch like what I said was sinking indifferently for her. Bronwyn tried to say something, slipping into that old role, trying to act like things weren't broken. And maybe she thought she still had some grip on the situation on me. Old habits or wishful thinking. Yeah, I didn't really care anymore. I cut her off before she even got started. "You're not my family anymore." They all knew it, of course. Had to. But hearing it spelled out, hearing the finality of it, that's what broke the silence. Riz shrugged, barely interested. I expected as much from him. He and Bronwyn always told themselves whatever they needed to sleep at night, to justify everything. But Amber, her face changed. Her expression moved from shock to something approaching guilt, embarrassment maybe. She had always been the one to absorb things slower, to linger on details after everyone else had moved on. I'd figured she'd come to realize eventually. But now? Did she feel it now? Was it crashing down on her in this very moment? Bronwyn was still trying to assert as her, trying to navigate the conversation back to something familiar. "You can't just walk away, Wallace. We were your family, we are." I didn't let her finish the sentence, head calmly nodding. I just signed off. The image disappeared from the screen, leaving a faint reflection of me and Dao behind it, like ghosts of the past sitting with ghosts of the present. Fitting in a way. But something loosened in my chest, the last fraying thread of my old life. Gone. The moment I shut the laptop, I felt Dao's presence steadying me. Her practical silence, her support that didn't ask for anything in return, was grounded in reality, not illusion like what Bronwyn had tried to hold on to. For a long stretch afterward, I busied myself with living. Everything changed in Thailand, the simplicity, the rhythm, the peace of not constantly trying to repair walls that should have never been built. Towan and Palin kept me on my toes, and Dao's calmness was this constant, quiet force that brought more stability to my life than I'd ever imagined possible. Days felt fuller, realer. But sometimes as I sat alone at the end of the day, with nothing to repair, no business fires to put out, no Bronwyn went to scream at, my mind wandered back to the past. Amber's face crept into those moments more often than I admitted. The sharp guilt in her expression that last time I saw her stuck with me. From what I knew, Riz never looked back. I didn't expect him to. He and Bronwyn circled around each other in that same pattern, all wrapped up in their own justifications. But Amber, there was something in her silence, the way she didn't say a damn thing during the whole video call, that lingered with me. It was almost like she was holding back, not out of indifference, but out of awareness. Like she couldn't face what she'd done. So I'd made my peace with severing myself from them. That decision was final. But the guilt, theirs didn't just evaporate because I'd cut things off. Turns out Amber couldn't shake it. Some weeks passed before I found out nothing from her directly, just a casual remark from one of Dow's relatives about a foreign young woman making inquiries at the local market. Said she was asking people at a cafe about me, of all things. It didn't make sense to me at first. What the hell would Amber be here for? But as more word got back to me, it clicked. She was coming. Maybe the guilt had finally sunk in after all. Piecing together what I heard from neighbors, she was stumbling her way here like a misguided ghost, battling whatever storm had risen in her chest since that call. Amber showed up out of nowhere. Really, I didn't even think she had it in her. I'd heard she'd been asking around, trying to figure out where I'd gone off to, but I never thought she'd actually make the journey halfway across the world to find me in Fiji. To call me off guard, that's for sure. First thing I noticed when she walked up to the house was how out of place she looked against the backdrop of the village. The bohemian skirts and loud patterns that matched her artistic streak didn't exactly blend in with the rustic simplicity of life here. Still, there she was, standing at the edge of the yard looking nervous as hell. I hadn't seen my daughter in God, how long had it been? Probably a couple of years at least. We hadn't spoken much after the blow-up back in the States. After everything fell apart, I figured it was time to start fresh and leave all that behind. Dow, Thorne, and Palin. Those were the ones who stood by me, the ones who were building their lives with me now. Not Amber, not Rhys, and certainly not Bronwyn. I had no idea what she expected. So I could feel the tension running through my body as she started walking toward me. Slow, like she wasn't, was Rhys couldn't even turn her away before she even got to the front steps. My hands were covered in dirt from working out in the garden. I didn't make a move, just stood there, squinting at her like some stranger had wandered onto the property. But then when she finally got close enough, there was this awkward pause. She opened her mouth a couple of times, like she didn't know where to start. But indecision, that right there. That's what pissed me off the most. I'd spent years dedicated to my family, giving everything I had, and when they had the chance to back me up, to at least acknowledge how much I'd put on the line, they'd all turned the other way. And now she was standing here struggling to find words. It felt almost absurd. I didn't know if you'd even talk to me, Amber finally admitted, her voice shaky quiet, her green eyes, the same ones that used to look at me with so much light when she was younger, now darted around nervously, unable to meet mine for more than a second. I crossed my arms over my chest, more to keep myself from clenching my fist than anything, really. The kids were playing in the yard not far from us, and Dow must have heard something from inside the house, because she peeked out from behind the front door, but I gave her a nod to let her know I had it handled. I could feel Dow's presence lingering, though, as if she was ready to step in if needed. The silence dragged out again before I realized Amber wasn't here just to throw around apologies. There was something heavier weighing on her. It wasn't just that guilty look in her eyes. She seemed smaller, lost, and something inside me shifted, if only slightly. I wasn't about to let my guard down, but I could let her speak. I gestured toward the porch where we both sat down on the steps, the space between us feeling like a chasm. She fumbled, explaining how things had gotten worse back home after I left, how Rhys had grown more and more distant, caught up in his own world now. And Bronwyn, well, apparently Nelson was as good as dead weight these days. Amber didn't mince words when she described how her mother was stuck playing nursemaid to the guy she threw everything away for. It was brutal, listening to her talk about how things had spiraled, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sympathetic. Yet, despite everything, it wasn't Bronwyn or Rhys that mattered to Amber now. She looked at me, that same pleading look she had when she was a little girl, back when she needed me to fix things. This time, though, she knew I wouldn't just snap my fingers and make everything right again. No, she wasn't here for that. She was here because she knew she'd been part of the reason it all went to hell, and now she didn't know how to dig herself out of the hole. I never should have taken Mum's side, she admitted, voice breaking as she pulled at the beaded bracelet on her wrist. It was starting to get worn, like she'd been tugging at it for months. I wasn't thinking, so I thought I was being loyal to her. But I was wrong, and I hurt you. The apology hung in the air like something tangible, something fragile between us. So I wasn't sure what to do with it. Hell, a few years ago I'd have jumped on that, thinking things could just be mended like fixing a crack in a piece of old furniture. But as she sat there trying to piece together her own guilt, I realized we weren't in that place anymore. Time had done its work. I looked out past her, to where Palin was running around barefoot, playing with Thawon. The kids didn't hold on to the past like adults did. They were easier in some ways, less bogged down by the ever-present weight of betrayal. I shifted on the step, unsure for a second whether I even cared to hear more. But the words fell out anyway. It's not that simple. I sat there with that, watching as Amber's posture deflated a bit, like she expected the cold shoulder and was prepared for it, even if it stung. She'd given up a lot too, she admitted, leaving Bronwyn and Riz behind. That wasn't easy for her, but she said it was something she needed to do for herself, not just because of me, but for her own sanity. Apparently she'd been trying to find her place since everything imploded, and like it or not, that search had led her here, to me. I wanted to tell her to leave. Part of me was waiting for the next push, a reason to slam the door on this broken thing for good. But looking at her sitting there, all nerves and shattered pride, I realized that wouldn't give me anything but more empty space. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. It had no place here. You came this far, I muttered, still not meeting her eyes. Might as well stick around. There was hesitation in the words, but I meant it. She flinched a little like she wasn't sure she heard right. Still, she nodded. For the next few days, things were awkward, to say the least. She stayed with one of the villager families, giving me space, but she showed up each morning hanging around the edges of my life, watching me slip into the daily routines I had here with Dao and the kids. At first, Palin was shy, hiding behind Dao's skirts whenever Amber tried to talk to her. But Thawon, curious as ever, broke the ice for everyone, asking Amber why she didn't live with her mother if she was an adult now. The bluntness hit hard, but Amber took it in stride. Slowly, the guard I'd been holding up started to crack. I didn't want to admit it, but seeing her try meant something. She wasn't just here for herself anymore. She was putting the work in, day by day, whether it was helping me in the garden or figuring out how she fit in with the kids and Dao. Speaking of Dao, she kept a distance at first, never one to push before someone was ready. But after a week, even she began teaching Amber how to cook a few meals with the usual herbs and ingredients we used for dinner. I could tell Dao didn't fully trust her yet either. Valid, given how much she'd heard in passing about my past with Amber and Bronwyn. But there wasn't tension like there had been between me and Amber when she first arrived. But Dao had this patience in her that I could never quite master. That's what made her the opposite of Bronwyn in so many ways. She didn't demand anything. She simply gave me the space to figure it out. Forgiving Amber happened slowly, if I'm being honest. Call it years of bitterness calcifying over, but it's not like you can just flip a switch and reset to who you once were. The past didn't change, but maybe we didn't have to drag it around forever, either. Our conversations grew easier, lingering a little longer as we sat out on the porch in the evenings, occasionally sipping on the cold tea Dao would bring us. It wasn't father-daughter banter like we used to have when she was a kid, but there was something better about it in a strange way, more real, less performative. She eventually stopped bringing up Bronwyn too. Guess she realized that chapter was closed. No point in trying to reopen it. Riz, well, I didn't ask about him. I hadn't forgiven him yet. I didn't think I was ready for that, and maybe never would be. It's not like Amber pushed me on that matter. Then, after a few more months of this steady rhythm, Amber made it clear she was staying.